the scheme of Indian Evidence Act, or for that matter, the evidence law in general. And for that, I told you that how the whole of Indian evidence law stands on three pillars. To paraphrase it, the whole of Indian evidence law is a quest in three directions, or is an attempt to answer three questions. So the first pillar on which the entire superstructure of Indian evidence law stands may be named as what? Meaning thereby that whenever any court is called upon to determine rights and liabilities, determination of those rights and liabilities would require determination of certain facts. And this is what we call the question of what. Or in other words, it has to be determined what has to be proved. The first pillar. So when you look at the scheme of Indian Evidence Act, you would find that around 51 provisions seek to answer this question of what. That would be later on explained as to what this what means in the language of law of evidence. And you would know that the answer is very simple. That only those facts which the court declares to be relevant are to be proved. So to this question, that what is to be proved, the answer would be that whatever is relevant is to be proved. So what is relevant is not a matter of guess, and has been very neatly, minutely and clearly and in a very systematic manner enumerated in sections from 5 to 55, or to be more precise, from 6 to 55. So the first pillar that we have named the what pillar comprises of these provisions from 5 to 55. 5 simply declares that nothing but what is relevant is to be proved, and what is relevant is in the next sections from 6 to 55. The second pillar is the how pillar, meaning thereby that it's all right that what is relevant is to be proved, but how is that to be proved? What is the manner in which that relevant fact has to be proved? And this is also enumerated in the scheme of Indian Evidence Act from 56, section 56 to section 100, both inclusive. So when you have to find out an answer, what is to be proved, you need to look into these sections 6 to 55. When you have to seek an answer as to how that has to be proved, you need to look into sections from 56 to 100. And the third pillar is by whom. Is that what is relevant in the manner that has been prescribed is to be proved. By whom? So that third pillar would be comprising of sections from 101 till the end, that is 167. Not to say that all the sections from 101 to 167 relate to this question, by whom, but certainly the majority of the provisions in this group of sections from 101 to 167 seek to answer this question. And then these are the only questions that would ever arise in any judicial proceeding where evidence has to be proffered. I had told you, you may remember, that ours is what we call the common law system, or more aptly, the adversarial system of justice, especially adversarial system of criminal justice, where you would find that the judge presiding over the proceedings in civil or criminal matter would be sitting as an impartial referee, and the parties would be required to proffer evidence of relevant facts in the manner that has been prescribed by the Indian Evidence Act, and the job of the judge is to appreciate those evidences. So it's not only about the question of what, how, and by whom, because these questions, what, how, and by whom, are neatly and precisely answered by the provisions of Indian Evidence Act. But even more important would be how to appreciate, how to evaluate, and you would find, to your horror, to your dismay, that the Indian Evidence Act hardly contains any rules for appreciation, and those rules of appreciation are, I think, more important than these rules that you find enumerated in different provisions of Indian Evidence Act for a practitioner. For a practitioner. So unlike other laws, you would find that how human element, how your character, how your personality, how your standing in the society, how your reputation determines the value that the court would be attaching to the evidence that you would be proffering as a witness to your testimony. And that makes, this is what I had mentioned in the last class as well, that makes the Indian evidence law, or for that matter, the evidence law in other common law countries, a more fascinating field of study. And if you have to find one piece of legislation which factors in not only human experience but also logic, not only logic and human experience but also social and moral values of the society where it functions, it is the Indian Evidence Act, or for that matter, the evidence law of that particular country. In that sense, I had told you that how, unlike other legislations, be it substantive law or procedural law, there would be a great deal of subjectivity in application of provisions of Indian Evidence Act. X and Y, they both testify. You would find to your horror as a practitioner that the court believes in what X says and disbelieves in what Y says, irrespective of the fact that whether both are speaking truth or both are lying. But that's not a demerit. That's not the fault of law of evidence. I don't think that there can ever be a law of evidence which would be answering all the questions relating to appreciation of evidence. That's not possible. Every human being is different. And when every human being is different, certainly the manner in which his or her testimony would be appreciated would also be different. And this is the fundamental rule, this is the fundamental principle. So when you look at the scheme of Indian Evidence Act, you would find, as I already elaborated, by referring to the three pillars on which the entire superstructure of Indian Evidence Act stands, that how beautifully, systematically and scientifically the Indian Evidence Act has been drafted. A tiny piece of legislation by any standard, when you compare it with other procedural laws, very crisp, very brief, spread over in just 167 provisions in all, many times lesser than what you find in the other procedural laws like CRPC, like CPC, which are very voluminous pieces of legislation. In almost 1.5 centuries of its existence, the Indian Evidence Act has answered almost all the questions. It won't be exaggeration to say that all the questions that ever arose before the Indian courts. About what, about how, about by whom, have an answer in these 167 provisions. I had also told you that how the practical law or the law in practice is largely the procedural law. I had also, you may remember, I had also quoted from that famous decision delivered by Justice Frankfurter way back in 1945, highlighting the importance of procedural law in securing and protecting liberty and freedoms of people in America. And I have no hesitation in saying that that observation, with the same vigor, with the same force, applies to the Indian legal system as well. It can be understood by, again, making a reference to the Indian Constitution. You have in Part 3 of the Constitution all the freedoms, rights, liberties. But minus Article 32, those freedoms, rights and liberties would be hollow promises. So you may have rights, liberties, obligations, duties in substantive law, but unless and until there is a mechanism for enforcement of those rights, privileges, for enforcement of those obligations, those rights, liberties, obligations, duties, they would not mean anything. But I had also told you that Indian Evidence Act is part of what we call the colonial legacy. But in spite of this fact that it is part of colonial legacy, what should go to its credit and to the credit of its architect, Sir James Stephen, is that in around 150 years old history of Indian Evidence Act and constitutional history of India, only one provision, that is Section 27, was ever challenged as being unconstitutional. Section 27 of Indian Evidence Act is a provision that we will be talking about in the context of constitutional scheme that we have. So it not only prescribes procedure, it not only lays down rules, but it also lays down what we today call due process. And often goes overboard. Making the law of evidence more suitable to the Indian conditions, to the Indian values. So this is one piece of legislation where you would find reflection of logic, embodiment of logic, embodiment of human experience, embodiment of cultural values, embodiment of social values, embodiment of principles of psychology, and though drafted by an out and out English man, can very well be said to be an Indian legislation in every sense. But what I would like you to wonder if you have not already started wondering, that no procedural law can have independent existence. It doesn't make any sense unless and until there is a substantive law. There's no question of there being a procedural law. First, you have the rights, liberties, obligations, duties, and then you have the mechanism for enforcement of those rights, liberties, duties, and obligations. So naturally, the IPC came first. But IPC is that of 1860 in force from 1862, and the Indian Evidence Act is that of 1872. So you must be wondering that how were prosecutions conducted? How were the criminal proceedings conducted in the Indian courts in the first decade? In the decade rather, before the Indian Evidence Act of 1872 came into being. What were the rules of evidence? And that takes us to the historical development. Very briefly, I will be touching upon that. 5-7 minutes. As you know, especially those who had history in their first semesters, that the legal system was not same across the British India. Even after the advent of Britishers and the transfer of power from East India Company to the British Crown, the courts that were situated in what we call presidency towns like Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, they were largely presided over by British judges, English judges, trained in English traditions, and had the liberty to administer English law. And evidence law was no exception. So it was the English law of evidence that was being administered in the courts in presidency towns. And as you know that, like other bodies of law, the English law of evidence was also not codified. But still, there was consistency, there was certainty in the law. But it was entirely different in the Mufassil towns, the smaller rural towns and districts of the then British India. And the judges were also not necessarily British and English judges. Majority of the judges were Indian. Of course, few judges were British judges, English judges, even in Mufassil courts. And they had no clue about the English law of evidence, especially the Indian judges. The population was also, I think, largely illiterate, as you know. Religion played very important role in people's life, both personal and professional. And initially they would be administering either the Hindu law of evidence, as it is so called, or Muslim law of evidence, or Islamic law of evidence, as it is so called. And both had their own demerits, discriminating on the ground of religion, caste, creed, and other extraneous considerations. So when it comes to the rules of evidence in Mufassil towns, the condition was even more pathetic. And I was reading somewhere that Justice Peacock, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at Calcutta, had decided in the case, very early case, that the Mufassil courts are not bound by English rules of evidence. But that was not all. It also said that the English courts, the Mufassil courts, are not bound by Hindu law of evidence or Islamic law of evidence either. So they were free to choose an appropriate rule of evidence based on the peculiar facts and circumstances of the case, and also following the principles of natural justice. Those rules were largely based on what we call equity and good conscience. But there was no consistency. And even if there were certain codified rules, they were spread over different regulations. Scores of regulations were there, embodying certain principles of evidence, certain rules of evidence. It has been reported by commentators on Indian Evidence Act that between 1853 to 1855, at least 11 different regulations were passed embodying different rules of evidence, different principles of evidence. So this period from 1853 to 1855 is marked as a period where serious efforts were made to codify, which culminated in Act number 2 of 1855, which was a conglomerate of almost 11 regulations, and was first serious attempt at consolidation of rules of evidence. But that was not complete. And it was only in the year 1868 that Sir Henry Maine, an English jurist of great repute, who was born in India, was trained in English traditions, of course, was entrusted with the task of preparing a codified law on evidence. And he in fact prepared what is in history known as the Draft Bill on Evidence Act. That Draft Bill of Evidence Act is that of 1868 for reasons that you would find in textbooks that talk about the history of Indian Evidence Act. this draft bill remained a draft. The reason that is attributed to it not seeing the light of the day was that it was a codification of English principles of it. Complete codification, without any modification, without any addition, without customizing it to suit the Indian conditions. This is what Henry Maine did. It was felt that wholesale importation of English principles of law of evidence is not suitable to Indian conditions. And the task was assigned to an out and out Englishman, Sir James Stephen, who single-handedly prepared this draft, which ultimately became what we today call the Indian Evidence Act of 1872. Not that Sir James Stephen didn't rely on the English principles of evidence, that's quite natural. You need raw material. And the raw material was provided by the English principles. But as I already said, that the Indian Evidence Act of 1872 encompasses not only the legal principles but also certain social values. And is also a reflection on certain traits that only Indians have, both positive and negative. You would be amused to know that how certain negative traits that the Indian people had influenced Sir James Stephen to qualify and modify certain principles of English law of evidence when those principles were incorporated in the Indian Evidence Act of 1872. When we will be moving to the specific provisions, especially when we will be talking about the relevancy or the question of what, and also the question of how, we will have some comparative insight into those provisions which are though based on English principles but can be said and must be said to be Indian in their flair and flavor. And then the reason why they are Indian, because they factor in, they recognize, they acknowledge the strengths and faculties of Indian people. The strengths that we all have in common, the frailties that we all have in common, the social factors, the moral factors, the moral values. So when in 1876 Stephen wrote Digest of Law of Evidence, he has commented on his own work in calling it based on English rules and little more. It's based on English rules, but there is little more than mere English rules. As I already said, that one of the best qualities of any legislation would be that it's crisp, it's brief. So this quality is in abundance as far as the Indian Evidence Act is concerned. In only 167 sections, Stephen has said everything that would ever be before the court as an issue, as a question, as a concern. Another thing that I guess I must say about this, though that is not squarely related to the Indian Evidence Act, that what a genius he was. That not only the Indian Evidence Act, but also the Indian Contract Act, which is of the same year, Indian Contract Act of 1872, and also the earlier CRPC, of which this present CRPC is only a replica. Even the sequence of provisions in the earlier CRPC and the present CRPC are same. The CRPC of 1898, the Indian Contract Act of 1872, they were all devised and designed by none other than Sir James Stephen. So it's apt to say that what Macaulay is to Indian Penal Code, Sir James Stephen is to the Indian Evidence Act, and to many more legislations which are still alive and kicking without any substantial and significant dilution. And you have already seen that the Indian Contract Act remains on the statute book undiluted. The Indian Evidence Act also remains on the statute book undiluted. Not that amendments have not been made. Those amendments didn't change. Amendments were made without changing the basic framework. And then even those amendments were necessitated by the change in times, necessitated by the advancements that the humankind has made on technological front. This is what you would find, this is what you would realize when you would be reading through the Indian Evidence Act. A lot of praise has been showered on Sir Stephen for his professional works. And then I was reading this article titled Reflections on J.F. Stephen, an article that was published in Queensland Law Journal in 2010, where the author John Heydon, Heydon, has revisited and has paid his tribute to the genius of James Stephen. And the highlight of that article is his contribution to the Indian legal system in the form of Indian Evidence Act, which, as I already said, is a masterpiece, is a classic piece of legislation which has no parallel. And it would be equally interesting for you to know that immediately in the aftermath of enactment of 1872 legislation, the Indian Evidence Act, Sir James Stephen was also called upon to prepare a similar kind of enactment for England, for the mainland England. But that couldn't be done even today. You'd find that how the rules of evidence as they apply in the English legal system, they are contained in varied legislation. Making the life of not only the students but also of the practitioners more difficult, which is not the case. But at the same time, I must also say that even the Indian Evidence Act is not an exhaustive code on principles of evidence. It doesn't exhaust the entire corpus of evidence. And then there are many other legislations where you would have other principles of evidence as well. What those legislations are and why it is apt to say that in spite of being the basic legislation on law of evidence, the Indian Evidence Act is not exhaustive body of rules of evidence. This would be taken up in the next class. That would probably be on a different platform, and I would be notifying you. So till then, bye bye.